She walked into that clinic with one decision made. She walked out with 3 lives growing inside her, and the most dangerous man in America hunting her down. One night, one mistake, one name she never should have learned. Lucian Blackthorne doesn't ask for what belongs to him. He takes it. And right now, the woman carrying his heirs is running out of time, out of options, and out of road. If you've ever believed that love could never survive a cage, stay with me until the very end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The debt collector called at 6:53 in the morning, which was earlier than usual and ruder than Vivian Mercer had the patience for on 4 hours of sleep and an empty stomach. She let it ring. She was already sitting at the kitchen table of her studio apartment in the kind of stillness that meant she hadn't slept so much as collapsed somewhere between midnight and dawn, and the sound of her phone buzzing against the laminate surface felt like a personal insult. The apartment was small enough that every noise was intimate. The pipes groaning in the walls, the neighbor's television bleeding through the ceiling, the refrigerator cycling with a rattle that had been getting worse for 3 months. She'd reported it to the landlord twice. He hadn't responded either time. The phone went silent, then started again. She picked it up, looked at the number, and pressed decline. Then she opened the banking app she'd been avoiding for 4 days and stared at the balance the way you stare at a car accident, knowing it won't change, unable to look away. $11.40. Her rent was due in 9 days. Her student loan had gone into collection 6 weeks ago. The medical bill from her emergency room visit in February, a kidney stone, the universe's idea of comedy, was sitting in a drawer under her socks because she'd learned that unread envelopes were at least psychologically manageable. She was 27 years old and she was drowning. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way people drown in movies with thrashing arms and someone watching from the shore. She was drowning the way most people actually drown, quietly, incrementally, in water that had been rising so gradually she hadn't noticed how far above her head it already was. She set the phone face down and pressed her palms flat against the table. There was one more thing, one more problem that she'd been circling for 11 days like a dog that knows something is wrong with a room but can't bring itself to go inside. She'd taken the test at 2 in the morning in the bathroom of a gas station because she hadn't been able to bring herself to do it at home, as if location would change the result. It hadn't. 2 lines, clear as a verdict. She hadn't cried. She wasn't sure what that said about her. The appointment was at 9. She'd made it the same night, sitting in her car in the gas station parking lot with the test in her lap and the engine running because she hadn't trusted herself to drive. The clinic was called Hargrove Women's Health, private, 15 minutes from her apartment. She'd found it online at 2 in the morning in the way you find things at 2 in the morning, desperately, efficiently, without allowing yourself to feel anything until the decision was already made. The copay was $340, which was money she did not have, which was why she'd called her sister Danny the next morning and said she needed help with a bill without specifying which one. Danny had sent the money within the hour and hadn't asked questions, which was either sisterly grace or the kind of practiced restraint that came from years of watching Vivian not be okay. She showered. She dressed in dark jeans and a gray sweater and kept her hair pulled back tight because loose hair felt like the kind of softness she couldn't afford today. She ate half a sleeve of crackers standing at the counter because there was nothing else in the apartment. Then she picked up her bag, her keys, and the folded printout of her appointment confirmation, and she walked out the door. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The clinic occupied the lower floor of a converted brownstone in a quiet residential block, the kind of street with mature trees and iron railings and window boxes that still held dried stalks from last autumn because no one had got around to replanting them. There was nothing about it that announced what it was. Small brass plate beside the door. Frosted glass. A short flight of steps. Vivian sat in the car across the street for 4 minutes, watching a woman in scrubs come outside and check her phone before she made herself get out. Inside, the waiting room was the color of calm. Soft greens, low lighting, chairs that were deliberately comfortable. The whole design language of a place that understood its clientele came through the door already carrying something heavy. There were 3 other women waiting, none of them looking at each other, all of them in that particular posture of controlled stillness that Vivian recognized immediately because she was doing it herself. She checked in at the front desk. She filled out the paperwork. She sat in the corner chair nearest the window and stared at a magazine she didn't open. Her name was called at 9:22. The nurse who led her back was brisk without being cold, the kind of professional warmth that was real but also economical, because there were other patients and the morning was already running behind. She took Vivian's blood pressure, her pulse, asked the standard questions in a standard order, and then explained that because of the time frame Vivian had indicated on her intake form, they'd need to do a quick ultrasound first, standard procedure, just to confirm gestational age. Vivian said that was fine. She lay back on the paper-covered table and stared at the fluorescent ceiling while the nurse applied gel to her lower abdomen with the matter-of-fact manner of someone who had done this 10,000 times, which she probably had. The ultrasound technician was a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the focused expression of someone doing a job that required precision. She moved the transducer slowly. She stared at the monitor beside the bed. She moved it again, adjusting the angle with small deliberate movements that Vivian, lying there watching her face, suddenly understood were not standard. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the way Vivian had been prepared for, not the clinical complications she'd steeled herself against. Wrong in the way the technician's expression had shifted. Not alarmed exactly, but recalibrated. She had gone from doing a routine procedure to doing something else, something that required a second look. Ms. Mercer. The technician's voice was neutral but careful. I'm going to need the doctor to come in and confirm what I'm seeing. Vivian's stomach contracted. What are you seeing? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be its own kind of answer. Dr. Fahey will explain everything. Just give me 2 minutes. The 2 minutes were the longest Vivian had spent in recent memory. She lay on that table, gel cooling on her skin, staring at the monitor that the technician had angled just slightly away, and she cataloged every irrational possibility with the grim efficiency of someone whose brain had been running disaster scenarios since childhood. Something was wrong with her, something serious. There was a complication that changed everything. Dr. Fahey was a compact, silver-haired woman who moved fast and spoke precisely, and sat down beside the ultrasound machine with the ease of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned that delay made it worse. Miss Mercer, I want you to take a breath for me. Vivian did not take a breath. Just tell me. Dr. Fahey turned to the monitor so Vivian could see it. There was a moment of complete incomprehension. The image was gray and grainy and shadowed in the way ultrasound images always were, shapes that required training to read. But then the doctor used a pen to indicate 3 separate areas on the screen, 3 distinct and unmistakable presences, and Vivian's brain went completely offline. You're carrying triplets, Dr. Fahey said. 3 heartbeats, all strong, all measuring within the expected range for gestational age. This appears to be a spontaneous trichorionic pregnancy. 3 separate embryos, each in its own amniotic sac. It's rare, approximately 1 in every 8,000 pregnancies. Vivian stared at the screen. The father, Dr. Fahey continued carefully, do you have any family history on his side of... I don't know him, Vivian said. Her voice came out flat and strange, like a voice from another room. I mean, I met him once, at a wedding, 2 months ago. I don't know his... She stopped. She pressed her hand against her sternum. 3. The room was very quiet. The fluorescent light hummed. Ms. Mercer, given this information, I do want to discuss your options with you because the situation is medically more complex than... The first sound was distant enough that Vivian's brain categorized it as irrelevant. Something outside, traffic, someone on the street. The second sound was closer and louder and unmistakably wrong. A door hitting a wall with the force of someone who hadn't bothered to open it so much as remove it from their path. Then voices in the corridor, raised and sharp and not medical in any way, and the technician took 1 step toward the door and then stopped because the door opened and the man who filled the doorway was holding a gun. He was not large. He was lean and pale and dressed in the kind of unremarkable clothes that were designed not to be remembered, and the gun was held with the ease of long practice. Behind him in the corridor, Vivian could hear more voices. The receptionist saying something that cut off abruptly, a sound that she understood without wanting to understand it. Vivian Mercer, the man said. He wasn't asking. Every synapse Vivian had fired at once. She looked at him. She looked at the gun. She looked at the single window on the far side of the room, which was small and was open 2 inches for ventilation, and she understood with the pure animal clarity of someone who has never been in danger before but has always known what to do when it comes. She had approximately 4 seconds before rational thought became irrelevant. She threw herself sideways off the table. The gel-smeared probe clattered. The technician screamed. Vivian hit the floor and was moving before she fully understood that she was moving. Hands and knees and then feet, crossing the room with the low, desperate scramble of someone who had exactly one idea. The window. She hit the wall beside it and got her fingers under the frame and shoved upward, and the window rose with the shrieking resistance of old paint in the track, and she was through it before she knew she could fit, the sill catching her hips hard enough to bruise. And then she was falling. The drop was 6 feet onto a concrete service alley. She hit it badly, one knee and both palms, and the impact drove the breath out of her completely. For a count of 3, she simply knelt there on the dirty concrete in the narrow strip between the clinic's back wall and a wooden fence, lungs locked, unable to process anything. Then something, instinct or adrenaline or some older wiring that had nothing to do with thought, forced her upright. She ran. The alley opened at the far end onto a side street. She went left because left was away from the front of the building, and she kept moving with her jaw locked and her breath coming in ragged pulls and her palms bleeding from the concrete. She didn't look back. Looking back was the thing you did when you had time to gather information, and she did not have time. She had the width of a city block before whoever that man was came through the window behind her or around the front, and the entire calculation collapsed. She made it 4 blocks. 4 blocks of moving fast with her head down, cutting through a narrow passage between 2 buildings, doubling back along a parking lot, trying to put distance and angles and corners between herself and wherever she'd just been. Then her legs went. Not dramatically, not a clean collapse. They simply declined to carry her further without rest, and she staggered sideways and put her shoulder against the cold brick wall of someone's rear stairwell and stood there shaking. She was still shaking when the black SUV pulled slowly to the end of the alley. She saw it and had time to turn, had time to take 2 steps toward the opposite end of the passage, and then the second SUV was already there, blocking the other exit, and the men getting out of both vehicles moved with the synchronized efficiency of people who had done this many times and were not hurrying because they didn't need to. She pressed herself back against the wall. Nowhere to go. Brick on 3 sides and men in front, and the knowledge settling into her chest with horrible finality that the running was over. The man who walked toward her was not holding a gun. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in a dark coat, his hands loose at his sides, his face. She looked at his face and felt the bottom fall out of something she couldn't name, because she knew that face. She had known it for exactly 6 hours, 2 months ago, in the amber light of a hotel ballroom at her sister Danny's wedding, and she had told herself afterward that she would never see it again because men like that didn't orbit the same world as women like her. Men like that existed in a different register entirely. She had been correct about that, as it turned out. Only not in the way she'd meant. "Vivian," he said. His voice was the same, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had never needed it. She had spent 6 hours listening to that voice at a wedding she hadn't wanted to attend, at a table in the corner while Danny danced with her new husband, and she had made the catastrophic mistake of thinking that because he looked at her like she was the only person in the room, she was safe. "My name is Lucian Blackthorne," he said, "and I need you to come with me." She said, "I know your name." She did not know his name. "And I'm not going anywhere with you." He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's heard something technically incorrect but doesn't want to embarrass you by saying so. "You're bleeding." He nodded toward her palms. "I'm aware." "You're also in shock." "Also aware." "And you're carrying—" He stopped. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not cold the way the rest of his face was cold. Something that did not belong in the expression of a man flanked by armed men in a dark alley. "Come with me, please." The please was what undid her, not because it was warm, it wasn't particularly, but because it sounded like a word he didn't use often, a word that cost him something, and the expenditure of it here meant something that she was too frightened and too raw to fully interpret. "I don't have a choice," she said. Not a question. A pause. "No." She looked at the men behind him. She looked at the two vehicles blocking either end of the alley. She looked at her own hands, scraped and bleeding, and thought about what was inside her body right now. 3 heartbeats, the doctor had said, 3 distinct and impossible presences, and she made the calculation she had been making her entire life. What losses could she afford, and which ones would kill her? She pushed off the wall and walked toward him. He didn't touch her. He walked beside her to the nearest SUV and opened the rear door himself. And when she got in, he got in on the other side, and the vehicle moved before anyone spoke again. The interior was immaculate and smelled like leather, and something that might have been expensive cologne or might have just been money, the raw, ambient scent of a world where every surface was chosen deliberately. The windows were deeply tinted. Through them, the city moved past in blurred motion, the familiar streets of her neighborhood becoming unfamiliar from this angle and this speed, and she watched them go and understood that she was watching something else leave too. The version of the morning she'd planned, the version of the decision she'd already made, the version of her life that had been terrible and limited and entirely hers. "You sent those men," she said, "to the clinic, to find you." He was looking forward. "Not to frighten you. The situation required urgency." Someone pointed a gun at me. Something crossed his jaw. "That was not authorized. I've been made aware." "Oh well, glad there's a policy." He looked at her then. Directly, the way he'd looked at her at the wedding, which was also the way he'd looked at her in the hotel corridor and in the elevator and every other moment of those 6 hours, as if he'd already accounted for every other variable in the room, and she was the only one that still required his attention. It was not a comfortable way to be looked at. It was the opposite of comfortable. But it was, she had noticed then and noticed now, absolutely genuine. "How far along?" he asked. The question landed like a physical thing. She turned to look out the window. "Ask your doctors." "Vivian." "You don't get to say my name like that," she said, still looking at the window, "when I don't even know your last name." She paused. "Blackthorn. I still don't know anything about you." "You'll learn." "Great. And what exactly am I learning it in? A dungeon? A compound? What's the appropriate word for wherever I'm being taken against my will?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the city had thinned. They were moving faster now, the buildings less dense, the traffic dissolving. She recognized they were heading north, away from the grid, toward the kind of geography that didn't appear on the maps her life had occupied until now. "My home," he said finally. "Your home," she repeated. "You're kidnapping me and taking me to your home. I'm securing you and bringing you somewhere safe." "Those are the same thing." "They're not." She turned from the window to look at him full on, because she was angry enough now that the fear had a different texture, sharper, more useful, the kind of anger that makes the hand stop shaking and the mind start working. "You understand that what you are doing right now is a crime." He met her eyes. "Yes." "And you're doing it anyway." "Yes." "Because of—" She couldn't finish that. She pressed her lips together. "How did you even know about the appointment? About— How did you know?" "I've had people monitoring you since the morning after the wedding." The silence that followed that statement was enormous. "Monitoring me," she said carefully, "for your safety. You've been surveilling me for 2 months." "Yes." "Without my knowledge." "Yes." She looked at the back of the driver's head. She looked at the window. She looked at her own hands, palms still raw, and she breathed through her nose slow and deliberate, the way she'd learned to breathe through things that were too large to process all at once. "And when the appointment showed up, I was notified immediately. And you thought the correct response was to send men with guns. I told you the weapon was not Lucien." The name came out before she'd consciously decided to use it, and it stopped him the way she hadn't expected, a small but complete cessation of whatever he'd been about to say. She pressed the advantage because she had so few. "I was making a decision about my own body, in a medical facility, and you sent armed men to stop me." A long pause. Outside, the last of the city fell away entirely, replaced by the first suggestion of open land, trees appearing along the roadside, the sky wider and grayer and without buildings. "Yes," he said, "because they're yours." She heard her own voice saying it and hated how true it sounded. "That's what this is. You found out and you couldn't—" "They're ours," he said quietly. The word landed differently than she'd expected. Not possessive exactly, not the claim of a man asserting property. Something else, something fractured and careful and very slightly desperate, which was not a quality she would have attributed to him based on anything else about this vehicle, this situation, the men with guns. She looked at him again. His profile, the angle of his jaw, the way his hands rested in his lap, completely still, completely controlled. The stillness of a man who had learned very early that visible feeling was a liability. She had 3 lives inside her. She had $11.40 in her bank account. She was bleeding from both palms in the back of a car she hadn't chosen, going to a destination she hadn't agreed to, and the man sitting 2 feet away from her was simultaneously the cause of all of it, and the only person in the current situation who could potentially be moved. She filed that away. The estate appeared the way dreams sometimes do. Gradually at first, then all at once. The gated entrance materializing out of the tree line with a quiet authority that suggested the gate itself was almost ceremonial, because nothing that needed to be kept out could get past what stood on the other side. The grounds through the iron bars were immense. She could see it even from the road, the scale of the land, the long approach. The building set back so far, it was initially just a shape against the gray late morning sky. Inside the gate, the drive was smooth stone, bordered by old trees that arched overhead and turned the light green and gray in a way that might have been beautiful at another time. They swept in a wide curve, and the house resolved itself from abstraction into something massive and deliberate. 3 stories of pale stone, wings extending to each side, the kind of architecture that communicated permanence not as a boast, but as a simple statement of fact. This has stood. This will stand. The car stopped at the front steps. A man opened her door before she could reach the handle. She got out into cool air that smelled like rain somewhere distant and the faint mineral scent of stone. She stood at the base of the steps and looked up at the house and felt the full weight of where she was settled into her chest like something swallowed wrong. Lucian came around the front of the car and stood beside her. He was looking at the house, not at her. "The east wing is yours," he said. "Private rooms, bathroom, whatever you need. Dr. Sasha Keene is our in-house physician. She'll see you this afternoon and we'll get a proper prenatal workup started. You'll have access to the gardens, the library, the kitchen at any hour. And if I want to leave?" He was quiet for 2 seconds. "That's not possible right now. Right now. Not until—" He stopped. He was careful with the next words. "Not until I can guarantee your safety outside these walls. You understand that those men at the clinic were not sent by me. There are people who have become aware of your situation, and those people—" "What people?" The fear was back, clean and cold. "What are you talking about? Who else knows?" "Inside," he said. "We can discuss everything inside." She looked at the house. She looked at the gate behind her, already swinging closed. She looked at him, and he was watching her with that same absolute attention that had pulled her in at the wedding and that she now recognized for what it was. Not charm, exactly, not the performance of interest, but the focused regard of a man who genuinely did not look away from problems. She was the problem. She walked up the steps. The interior was what the exterior promised. High ceilings, pale walls, the kind of furniture that was impeccably chosen but not decorative, everything oriented toward function within beauty. There were staff she registered at the periphery, a housekeeper, 2 men whose particular alertness identified their actual role, a woman at the far end of a corridor who turned and moved away quickly. The house had the dense, muffled atmosphere of a place where many people worked very hard to be invisible. He led her up a staircase to the east wing. The rooms were 3 connected spaces, a sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom, with a tub large enough that she could have conducted the clinic appointment inside it. Everything was clean and prepared, as if someone had been told to make these rooms ready days ago, which, she understood with a sick lurch, they probably had. "Your phone," he said at the doorway. She looked at him. "I need it," he said. "Not permanently, just until—" "No." She put her hand in her pocket. "You've taken everything else. You're not taking my phone." He held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded. "Once." "Fine." He turned to leave, stopped, turned back. "Vivian, I know what this looks like." "Good," she said. "Then I don't need to describe it." He left. The door didn't lock. She checked immediately, pressing her ear against it, listening to his footsteps recede, then testing the handle. It turned freely. That surprised her. She stood in the center of the sitting room and turned slowly, cataloging exits, windows, the layout, the drop from each window to the ground. One window faced the drive, one faced the gardens at the rear. The garden-facing drop was to a terrace, maybe 12 feet. The drive-facing window was directly above the stone steps. Neither was ideal. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hands on her knees, palms up, the raw scrape stinging in the open air, and she looked at them and thought about the ultrasound monitor and the three shapes on the gray screen, three distinct presences that hadn't existed in any meaningful way in her mind until 40 minutes ago, and that now occupied a space in her chest that she had no name for. 3. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She was going to need a better plan than throwing herself through windows. 2 floors below, in a room that occupied the private northeast corner of the ground floor, and that was furnished with the particular austerity of a man who had spent decades ensuring that his professional and personal lives were completely indistinguishable, Lucian Blackthorne stood at a window and looked out at the gray afternoon sky and said nothing for a long time. Then he picked up the phone on his desk and called his head of security. "The clinic," he said when the call connected. "I want the name of the man who drew the weapon, and I want to know who sent those people before mine arrived. Someone knew she had that appointment, and it was not anyone in this organization." A pause. "Because I would like to be certain of that. Yes, start there." He ended the call. He looked at the window for another moment. Then he opened the top drawer of the desk and removed a photograph he'd been carrying for 8 weeks. Taken at the wedding, candid, a moment when Vivian Mercer had been laughing at something someone else said and had not been aware of the camera. He looked at it the way you look at evidence you haven't yet decided how to classify. He put it back. He had known for a long time that the decisions you make in the name of legacy are not always decisions you can defend as a human being. He had made peace with that distinction decades ago, or told himself he had. But now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, the distinction felt important in a way it hadn't before. He called his second. "I need a full security overlay on the east wing," he said. "Passive monitoring only. I want to know if she tries to leave, not stopped before she decides to. And get Celeste on the phone. I want her here by morning." He set the phone down. He stood very still in his quiet room, in his large house, in the late morning of a day that had recalibrated something fundamental in the machinery of his life, and he allowed himself approximately 30 seconds to feel what he felt. Then he buried it, the way he'd buried everything else, and went to work. Upstairs, Vivian Mercer lay on her back on a stranger's bed and thought about 3 heartbeats she hadn't asked for, in a house she hadn't chosen, belonging to a man she barely knew. A man she now understood was not what he had seemed at the wedding, not a guest like any other, not someone whose name she could search and verify. A man whose name, she was beginning to suspect, did not appear in the places where ordinary names appeared. A man whose home had this many security personnel and this few visible emotions, and that particular quality of stillness that comes not from peace, but from absolute, practiced, deeply internalized control. She turned her head and looked at the window. The garden below was quiet, the lawn stretching out in the gray light toward a line of trees that was too far to reach quickly. Beyond the trees, she had no idea. Nothing she could see told her how far from the nearest road she was, how far from any other person, how far from the life that had been miserable and broken, and entirely hers up until approximately 2 hours ago. She didn't know his business. She didn't know what he was. She didn't know who had sent the men to the clinic before his people had arrived, or why, or what it meant that he'd seemed genuinely disturbed by it, as if the threat had come from somewhere that surprised him, which meant there were things that could still surprise Lucian Blackthorne, which meant he was not invulnerable, which was the first piece of useful information she'd found since the morning started going wrong. She filed that too. She was going to be here for a while. She was going to be angry and frightened and completely alone in this immaculate cage of a room, and she was going to carry 3 lives she hadn't planned and could not currently afford, and she was going to have to find a way to use whatever limited leverage she possessed before she ran out of it. But right now, in this moment, before the fight properly began, she let herself feel exactly how terrified she was. She held it for 10 seconds, a full and honest count, and then she exhaled it slowly through her nose and pressed her spine flat against the mattress and looked at the ceiling until her pulse dropped back below 100. Then she sat up. She pulled her phone from her pocket. 1 bar of signal, barely, enough for text. She opened a new message to Danny. She typed, "I'm okay. Can't explain right now. Don't try to call me." She stared at it, deleted the last sentence, added, "Trust me." She sent it. The signal indicator blinked once and showed delivered, and then the single bar disappeared entirely, and she was alone with 3 heartbeats and a billionaire's ceiling and the particular clarifying silence of a situation that had just become, officially and irrevocably, a war. She found the limits of her prison on the 3rd day, not the physical limits. Those had been obvious from the first morning when she'd walked every accessible corridor of the East Wing and identified 3 stairwells, 2 of which terminated at locked doors, and 1 that opened onto the garden terrace but deposited her directly into the eye line of the security rotation that moved along the perimeter every 11 minutes. She'd timed it. 11 minutes, 2 men, overlapping paths that left no gap wider than 40 seconds on the garden side, and no gap at all on the drive side. Whoever had designed this coverage had designed it well, which told her something about the man who'd ordered it. The limits she found on the 3rd day were informational. Her phone had 1 bar of signal intermittently, enough to send texts, not enough to load anything, and she'd already tested whether calls connected. They didn't. She'd tried to search his name on the 2nd night, lying in the dark with the phone held up toward the window, where the signal was marginally better, and the page had loaded halfway and frozen, and when she'd tried again an hour later, the signal had dropped entirely. She didn't think it was coincidental. She knew his name. Lucian Blackthorne. She knew what the name felt like in the room. She'd watched the staff when he walked through a doorway, the way their bodies reoriented slightly, the way conversations stopped not out of fear exactly, but out of something more total than fear, the kind of alertness that comes from being in proximity to something with real consequence. She knew that his organization was not small. She knew that the men at the clinic had not been his, and that this had disturbed him in a way he'd controlled but not concealed. She knew that he'd been monitoring her for 2 months. What she didn't know was the full shape of what she was inside. Dr. Sasha Keene arrived on the afternoon of day 1, a tall, composed woman in her late 30s who carried a medical bag with the ease of someone who made house calls to addresses like this regularly, which Vivian understood was itself a piece of information. She was thorough and professional and kind in the way that suggested the kindness was genuine rather than performed, and she confirmed everything the clinic's ultrasound had shown. 3 viable pregnancies, strong cardiac activity, gestational age of approximately 8 weeks, trichorionic meaning each in its own separate sac, which reduced certain risks while amplifying others. She gave Vivian prenatal vitamins and a blood pressure cuff and a detailed list of what to eat and what to avoid, and said she'd be back in 4 days. Vivian asked her if she could help her leave. Dr. Keene looked at her with an expression that was not unkind. "That's not something I'm in a position to do," she said. "Is that fear talking or loyalty?" A pause. "Both," Dr. Keene said, which Vivian respected for its honesty. Lucian came to her rooms on the evening of the 1st day and again on the 2nd morning, and both times she conducted the conversation standing up because sitting down felt like a concession she wasn't prepared to make. He brought no warmth and no charm and no attempt at either, which she found perversely easier to manage than if he had. He was simply there, direct and undecorated, answering the questions she put to him with a bluntness that occasionally bordered on insulting, and that she recognized slowly as his version of respect. "What do you do?" she said on the 2nd morning. Not a question exactly, an opening. He was sitting across the room in the chair near the window, always in that chair, never closer, as if he'd decided on a distance and was holding it. And he looked at her for a moment before answering. "I run several enterprises." "What kind of enterprises?" "The kind that require a security team and a private physician." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. She crossed her arms. "Are you going to tell me, or are we going to keep doing this?" "Doing what?" "This." She gestured between them. "Where you tell me almost nothing, and I'm supposed to find it satisfying." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something drier than that, more reluctant. "What specifically do you want to know?" "Are you a criminal?" The almost smile disappeared. He held her gaze steadily. "Define criminal." "Lucian." "The world I operate in," he said carefully, does not map cleanly onto the categories most people use. I have legitimate business interests. I also have, he stopped, interests that are less easily explained. Organized crime, she said flatly. A silence that told her she was right. The Blackthorn name, she said. I've heard it. I just didn't. At the wedding, I didn't connect it. I wasn't thinking about. She stopped. She had not been thinking about anything at that wedding except the open bar and her sister's happiness, and the man across the table who'd looked at her as if she were worth looking at. Your family runs my family, he said, with a precision that suggested the word required handling. Built something over several generations that I inherited and that I run. Whether that makes me a criminal depends on who is asking and what laws they've chosen to enforce this week. I'm asking. He looked at her. Yes, by most definitions. Yes. She exhaled slowly. And the men at the clinic. The Moretti family. He said the name with the particular flatness of someone pronouncing a weather condition. Not emotional, simply factual, the way you say there's a storm coming. They have been aware of my situation for approximately 3 weeks. How they learned, I am still determining. But their interest in you is not personal. You represent leverage. The children you're carrying are heirs to this name and everything attached to it, and to the Moretti organization that means bargaining chips, she said. Yes. She sat down then, not as a concession, but because her legs made the decision independently, and she was too busy processing to override them. She sat on the edge of the chair and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the middle distance. So I'm not just your prisoner, she said. I'm a target, which is why you're here. That's a remarkable sentence. It's the truth. The truth, she said, is that you surveilled me, sent men to intercept me at a medical appointment, and brought me here against my will, and now you're telling me I should feel safer because of it. I'm not asking you to feel anything, he said. I'm telling you what the situation is. She looked at him. He was watching her with that same stripped-down attention, no performance, no softening, just the fact of his focus, which she was beginning to understand was the closest he got to reassurance. I want to talk to my sister, she said. That's being arranged. When? When I can ensure the call isn't traceable. 2 days. You're monitoring my communications. I'm protecting them. There's a difference. There really isn't, she said, and stood up and walked to the window, which was her way of ending a conversation she no longer had the energy to continue without saying something she'd regret. He left without another word, which was either consideration or control, and she had not yet determined which. Celeste Blackthorn arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. She came through the east wing door like weather. Not storm weather, the other kind, the kind that moves in warm and soft and smells like the season changing. She was 32, 2 years younger than Lucian, and she looked almost nothing like him except around the eyes, where the same particular darkness lived. Everything else about her was surface warmth. The easy smile, the open posture, the way she came straight to Vivian and took both her hands and looked at her as if she'd been genuinely worried. He told me everything, she said. Well, he told me as much as Lucian tells anyone, which is about 40% of it. But I filled in the rest. She sat down across from Vivian without being invited, with the ease of someone who didn't experience rooms as belonging to other people. You must be completely terrified. Vivian looked at her. I'm managing. God, you're like him. Celeste laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that required no audience. That's either very good or very complicated. She leaned forward. I'm not here because he sent me. I'm here because I find out about things, and then I go to them. It's a personality flaw. Ask anyone. Despite herself, despite everything, Vivian felt something in her chest loosen, very slightly, the way a muscle unknots when heat is applied. He has you locked up, Celeste said, dropping the lightness without warning, her voice going direct. I know what that looks like. I know what it feels like. I grew up in this house, so I have some basis for comparison, and I want you to know that I think what he's done is not okay. Even if his reasons are, even if he's trying to protect you, the method is not okay. No, Vivian agreed. It's not. He's going to tell you he had no choice. He always tells people he had no choice. Lucian has made an entire life out of believing that, and sometimes it's even true. She looked at Vivian steadily. But sometimes he just doesn't know any other way. Vivian studied her. The warmth was real. She was almost certain of that. But she was also not a fool, and she was inside a house that had already demonstrated several layers of agenda, and warmth was also the thing you led with when you wanted someone to stop watching their back. She filed it. She didn't close the door, but she didn't walk through it either. "Tell me about the Morettis," she said. Something shifted in Celeste's expression, fast and subtle, a recalibration. Then the openness returned, and Celeste settled back in her chair with the slightly weary look of someone who has explained a complicated family situation too many times. "They've been rivals for 30 years, Celeste said. The Morettis want what we have on the eastern seaboard, and they've never been able to take it, and that makes them unpredictable. Dangerous in the way that frustrated people are dangerous, not strategic, just willing." She paused. "When they found out about the pregnancy, how did they find out?" A beat. "We don't know yet." Lucian said the same thing. "Because it's true. There are very few people who knew. It's—" Celeste looked at her hands briefly. "It's a problem we're working on." "An internal problem," Vivian said. "Someone in this house told them." Celeste met her eyes. "Possibly?" "Yes." The word sat between them in the quiet room, and Vivian looked at this warm, open-faced woman across from her and thought, "You knew that before you came in here. You came in here knowing there was a leak, and you gave me warmth and honesty and the appearance of alliance, and I still don't know what you want." "I appreciate you coming," Vivian said, which was true in the narrow sense that she appreciated any information, from any source, in any form. Celeste smiled again. "I'm going to stay a few days, if that's all right." "It's not my house to say." "No," Celeste said, still smiling, "but it's your wing." The conversation with Lucian that evening was the worst one yet. He came at 7, which was when he came, punctual to the point of compulsion, and she was ready for him because she'd spent the afternoon thinking about what she needed to say and how to say it without losing ground she couldn't afford to lose. She was standing at the window when he knocked. He always knocked, which she'd noted and still didn't fully understand, and she said, "Come in," without turning around. She heard him enter, heard the door close, heard him settle into the chair by the window. Always that chair, always that distance. And then she turned to face him and said, without preamble, "I need you to understand something, not as a negotiating position, as a fact." He waited. "I was at that clinic making a decision," she said, "about my own body, my own life. And whatever your reasons, whatever the threat is, whatever the Moretti family wants, you took that away from me. You made that choice for me. And I need you to understand that I know that, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." Something happened in his face. It was not guilt, exactly. She didn't think he was built for guilt in the standard architecture. It was something older and less clean. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who knows what he has done and has no defense prepared because he decided the defense didn't matter. "I know," he said. "That's it? You know? What would you like me to say?" "I'd like you to say you're sorry." She held his gaze. "I'd like you to mean it." A long silence. The light outside had gone the color of old pewter, the last of the afternoon dying, and in the room's lamp-lit quiet, she could see him with unusual clarity. The tension across his shoulders that never left, the set of his jaw, the eyes that watched her the way they always watched her, as if she were the only thing in the room worth solving. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the clinic, for the weapon, for—" He stopped, pressed on. "For the monitoring. For all of it." "But you'd do it again." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Because of them," she said. Her hand moved, not toward her stomach exactly, but in that direction, arrested. "Because they're the heirs." "Because they're alive," he said, and something in his voice changed register slightly, dropped below the controlled professional tone into something rougher and less managed. "Because they exist and they are mine, and no one is going to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at the window. She watched him do this, watched him pull it back in, that brief exposure, watched him seal it up with the practiced speed of a man who had been doing exactly this since childhood, and she felt something shift in her, some small, unwilling movement in the wall she was trying to maintain. "Your mother," she said quietly. Not an attack, just a direction. His eyes came back to her, hard. "Celeste said you grew up in this house," Vivian said. And the way she said it, Celeste says many things. She said it like growing up here was something that required recovery. Vivian kept her voice even, like it was a condition. He was very still. I'm not asking to hurt you, she said. I'm asking because I'm carrying 3 children, and their father is a man I know almost nothing about, and I'm trying to understand who you actually are, not what you do. Who you are. The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he was going to stand up and leave without answering, which would have been its own form of answer. But he stayed in the chair, and he looked at the window for a moment longer, and then he said, My mother left when I was 6. She had reasons she considered adequate. She was not. She found this life, what my father built, she found it unacceptable. He paused. She found us unacceptable, and she left, and I was told she'd come back. For about 4 years, I was told that. Vivian said nothing. She didn't come back, he said. So, he looked at her. That's who I am. Someone who learned early that the people who should stay don't, and built everything else around that fact. The room was very quiet. I'm not her, Vivian said finally. No, he said. You're someone I've trapped in her old house, which is not materially better. It was the most honest thing he'd said, and it landed between them like something fragile. Not broken, just exposed. She looked at him, this damaged and dangerous man in his controlled stillness, and she did not forgive him, because forgiveness was a long road from where they were standing, and she was not naive about the distance. But she filed a new piece of information. He knew exactly what he was. He had no illusions about himself. And that, in a strange and specific way, was the most frightening thing he'd told her yet. Because it meant he wasn't going to change course. Not because he was cruel, but because he had decided what mattered and arranged everything else around it, and she was now inside that arrangement, and clear eyes and genuine remorse were not the same thing as an open door. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her. The distant sounds of security personnel, the faint mechanical hum of whatever systems ran silently behind these walls. And she turned the situation over the way you turn something in your hands when you're trying to find the edge that gives. She had Celeste, whose warmth she didn't entirely trust, but whose presence created a variable in a situation that had been too static. She had Lucian, who was honest when pressed, and who had one visible wound, his mother, abandonment, the fear beneath the control. She had a phone with intermittent signal and a sister who hadn't called back yet. And she had the knowledge, settling in more completely each day, that the Moretti family knew where she was, and that someone inside this house had told them. She was still working through the geometry of that when her phone buzzed at 11:43. A text. Unknown number, no name. You're being used. He doesn't love you. He needs what you carry. When the babies come, you disappear. I can get you out. Reply if you want to live. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she screenshotted it, locked the phone, put it under the mattress, and lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling with her heart hammering against her ribs because someone with a phone number she didn't recognize had just told her to run. And the most terrifying thing wasn't the threat in the message. It was that she couldn't tell yet whether the person sending it was trying to save her or deliver her directly into the hands of the people who wanted her most. She showed Lucian the message at 7 the next morning, not because she trusted him, not because she'd decided lying awake at 11:43 with her pulse hammering that he was the right person to bring it to. She showed him because she'd spent 4 hours working through every alternative and each one terminated at the same dead end. She didn't know who had sent that text, which meant she didn't know whether responding to it would free her or hand her to the Moretti's gift wrapped, and she couldn't make that calculation alone with the information she currently had. So she handed him this phone and watched his face. He read it once. His expression didn't change. Not the jaw, not the eyes, not the set of his shoulders. But his hand tightened on the phone in a way she didn't think he was aware of. A small involuntary contraction that told her the message had landed somewhere real beneath the surface. When did this come in? He said. 11:43. You didn't tell me last night. I needed to think first. He looked at her. About whether to respond. About everything. She held his gaze. Including whether you already knew about it. Something cold moved through his eyes. Not anger, or not only anger. You thought I sent it. I thought it was possible, as a test, to see what I'd do. She kept her voice even. You've demonstrated a fairly comprehensive interest in monitoring my behavior. He set the phone down on the table between them with careful control. I didn't send it. I know that now. Your face when you read it was real. You read faces. I read people. It's what you do when you grow up without money. You learn to figure out who's going to help you and who's going to cost you before they open their mouth. She picked the phone back up. The number. Can you trace it? My people already are. I forwarded it to Marcus when you handed me the phone. He stood. Give me 2 hours. And in those 2 hours? Stay in this wing. Don't talk to anyone about this. Not staff, not... He stopped. Not Celeste, she finished. A pause that was a full sentence. Not anyone. She watched him leave and noted that he hadn't said not Celeste out loud. And she noted what that meant, and she filed it in the part of her mind that had been building a map of this house's interior logic. Not its corridors, but its loyalties, its pressures, the invisible load-bearing walls that held the whole structure up. The 2 hours became 4. She spent them in the sitting room, moving between the window and the chair, and the window again, doing the calculations she'd been doing since the first night and finding that they came out differently now. The message had changed something. Not her position. She was still here, still watched, still without any viable exit. But the geometry had shifted, because if someone inside the estate had contacted her, that meant someone inside the estate wanted her out badly enough to risk Lucian finding out. And the question of who and why had moved from abstract to urgent. She was at the window when she heard Celeste's voice in the corridor, bright and unhurried, talking to someone on the other side of the door. Then a different voice, lower, responding. Vivian stood very still and listened, but the words were below the threshold of clarity, just the music of the conversation, the tone of it, the rhythm. Celeste's voice had its usual warmth. The other voice had something that sounded like deference, then silence. Then Celeste knocked and opened the door simultaneously, which was her habit. The knock a formality she performed out of minimal courtesy rather than actual expectation of being told to wait. She came in with a small tray, coffee, which Vivian had been cleared to drink in limited quantities, and something that looked like a pastry from the kitchen downstairs. You look like you didn't sleep, Celeste said. I didn't. The pregnancy or something else. Vivian accepted the coffee and watched Celeste settle into the chair across from her with the ease of someone who had been coming into this room for days and had stopped feeling like a guest. Where were you last night, after dinner? Celeste tilted her head slightly. In my rooms. Why? Just orienting myself. Vivian kept her voice light, conversational, the way you keep a line light when you're trying to feel for tension at the other end. This house is still confusing at night. I heard movement in the corridor around midnight. That's probably the security rotation. They change at midnight. Celeste picked up her own coffee. Did something happen? No. Vivian looked at her over the rim of her cup. I'm just restless. Celeste looked back at her with that open, warm expression that Vivian had been studying for 3 days, and Vivian looked for the seam, the place where the performance met the person underneath, and found nothing she could isolate. Either Celeste was exactly what she appeared to be, or she was very, very good. Lucian came back at noon. He didn't knock. He came through the door with Marcus behind him, his head of security, a dense, quiet man in his 40s who moved like someone perpetually calculating distance, and the look on Lucian's face was one she hadn't seen before. Not cold, not controlled, something stripped of all the usual management, raw in a way that made the room feel suddenly smaller. I need you to sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. Vivian. Just her name, but the way he said it, the weight of it. She sat. He sat across from her. Marcus remained at the door. Lucian pressed his hands flat on his knees and looked at her directly. No deflection, and said, The number traces to a burner phone purchased 6 days ago in the town 15 miles east of here. The phone pinged 2 towers. One is the town. One... He stopped. One is this property. The room went very quiet. The message was sent from inside the estate, she said. Yes. She breathed. Who? He held her gaze for a moment that felt like a long time. Then he said, We pulled the internal security logs for the past 2 weeks. Communications, movement, access. There's a pattern. He paused. Celeste has been in contact with Aldo Moretti. Direct contact. 11 times in 14 days. The coffee cup in her hand was warm, and she held it and did not move and looked at the space 6 inches in front of Lucien's face while her mind did something she had no word for. Not shock exactly, because some part of her had known since the first day that the warmth was too easy, too immediate, too precisely calibrated. But knowing something might be true and having it confirmed were different experiences, and the confirmation moved through her like cold water. She sent the text, Vivian said. We believe so, yes. Why? Not asking for information, asking something else, asking how, asking what kind of person, asking the unanswerable thing beneath the answerable one. There are things between Celeste and me. His jaw moved. Old things. About how this organization is run. About decisions I've made that she disagreed with. About our mother. He said the last word with a flatness that did not conceal the edges beneath it. She wants leverage. She wants to force a restructuring of how the Blackthorn interests are managed, and the Morettis have promised her a position if she delivers what they want. What they want, Vivian said. Me. The children you're carrying. She set the coffee cup down because her hand had started to shake, and she was not going to let that be visible. She pressed both palms flat on her thighs and looked at Lucien and said very quietly, Your sister. The person I have been talking to every day for 3 days. She was telling them where I was. What I said, She stopped. Everything I told her. Not everything you said. She didn't have direct access to our conversations. But your movements, your mood, your level of trust in the security here. He looked like the words cost him something. Yes. And you didn't know. A pause. No. Your own sister. His jaw tightened. She is... He stopped. She has always been willing to do things I didn't anticipate, but this... He looked away briefly, toward the window. No. I did not anticipate this. Vivian stood. She couldn't stay in the chair. Her body required movement, required the use of muscle and breath as some kind of counter to the thing happening in her chest, which was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific pain of having opened a door toward someone and found the opening used against you. Where is she now? She said. In her rooms. She's not free to move through the house. She doesn't know you know. Not yet. Vivian walked to the window. Below, the garden was gray and quiet, the trees at the perimeter standing dark and still. 11 minutes between rotations. 40 seconds. She'd been counting security gaps for a week, planning escape routes, looking for leverage, and Celeste had been downstairs counting them too, for the opposite purpose. What happens now? She said. I need to talk to her. And then, his voice came from behind her, steady, but with something underneath it that sounded like a man keeping something from breaking through. And then the situation changes significantly, because if Celeste has been feeding them information, they know more than I thought they knew, which means the threat level is higher, she said. Yes. She turned to face him. So what I've been told, that I'm here because it's safer than being outside, then that's still true. More true than it was yesterday. She looked at him. At this man who had kidnapped her and imprisoned her and whose family had just demonstrated that the danger was not only outside the walls. Your house has a leak, and the leak is your sister. And I'm supposed to feel safe here. No, he said simply. You're supposed to be safe here. Those are different things. I know the difference. She held his gaze for a moment, then she said, I want to be in the room when you talk to her. That's not... I want to be in the room. Her voice didn't rise. It went quieter, which was its own kind of force. She spent 3 days looking me in the face. I want her to do it again, with me knowing what I know. A long silence. Marcus shifted slightly at the door, a small movement that suggested this was outside standard protocol, and he had opinions about it. Lucien looked at her with that focused, absolute attention. Then he said, Fine. They went to Celeste's rooms together, and Vivian walked slightly behind and to the left of Lucien, and she was aware of Marcus 2 steps behind her, and she was aware of the weight of the house around them, the staff who moved out of the corridor as they approached, the particular silence of a house in which something has shifted on its axis, and every person within it has registered the change. Celeste opened the door before they knocked. She'd known they were coming. She would have, with her knowledge of this house's rhythms. And she'd had time to compose herself. She was standing in the center of her sitting room in dark clothes, her hair pulled back, and the warmth was gone. Not hidden, not suppressed. Gone. The way a light goes when the power cuts, leaving the room exactly as it was, but showing you for the first time how much of it was artificial. She looked at Lucien. She looked at Vivian. Something moved across her face that might have been shame, or might have been calculation, or might have been both in a proportion Vivian couldn't measure. "How long?" Lucien said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Celeste looked at her brother. "Longer than 14 days. The logs only go back 2 weeks. If you check further, how long?" She lifted her chin slightly. "Since I found out she was pregnant. Since you told me." She held his gaze. 2 months, Lucien. I've been talking to Aldo for 2 months. The silence that followed was the densest thing Vivian had ever stood inside. She watched Lucien absorb it, watched the information land, and watched him not move, not visibly react, because he had built an entire life out of not reacting. And even this could not fully breach that architecture. But his hands at his sides were absolutely still in the way that things are still right before they're not. "The text," he said. "Last night. You told her to run. I told her the truth." Celeste's voice was steady. "That you want the heirs, not her. That when the babies come, she becomes a liability. That the Morettis would... You told her the Morettis would protect her." The quiet in his voice was worse than volume. "You told her to walk into the hands of the people who would use her children as collateral against me. I told her she had options you weren't offering her. You told her to trust Aldo Moretti." He took one step toward her, and it was the step of a man who had controlled this much energy for this long and was now at the precise outer edge of that control. "You told a pregnant woman with no resources and no protection to contact a man who would put her in a room and not let her out until he'd extracted everything he wanted from her situation. You told her that was freedom." Celeste looked at him. "I told her she had a choice. You took her choice away. I gave it back. You gave her to them. I gave her an exit from you." Vivian had been standing in the room listening to this, and something had been building in her. Not rage, not yet. Something colder and more precise. The thing that lives beneath rage when you've been frightened for too long, and the fear has burned down to its alloy, the part that doesn't shake. She stepped forward. "Look at me," she said to Celeste. Celeste looked at her. "You came into my room," Vivian said. "Well, 3 days. Every morning. You sat across from me and you held my hands and you told me you were on my side." She kept her voice level, each word placed with care. "You told me Lucien was damaged. You told me his method was wrong. You were building trust with me so I would do what you needed me to do, so I would run toward the exit you'd prepared." Celeste's jaw moved. "Did they tell you what they'd do with me?" Vivian asked. "After. Once they had what they wanted from the pregnancy." "Did Aldo explain that part?" Nothing from Celeste. "Did you ask?" Vivian said. The silence was its own answer. Something crossed Celeste's face then, fast and quickly buried, but real. It might have been the first real thing Vivian had seen from her. Lucien said, in a voice from somewhere below the floor, "Get out." Celeste looked at her brother. "Get out of my house," he said, "tonight. Marcus will arrange—" "Lucien, you're done here." 3 words, absolute as walls. Whatever you wanted, whatever you thought you were doing, you're done. You put her in danger. You put them in danger. And you knew what the Morettis would do, and you... He stopped. The muscle in his jaw was working steadily. "We're finished. Do you understand me? We are finished." Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression. It was not remorse. It was something harder and older. The look of a person who made a choice they understood was unrecoverable and is now standing in the wreckage of it without sufficient regret to make a difference. Then she looked at Vivian. "I'm sorry," she said, and the terrible thing was, it sounded true. Vivian said nothing. Marcus took Celeste out of the room. Vivian and Lucien stood alone in Celeste's sitting room. For a moment, that felt out of time. The aftermath quiet in a way that was not peaceful, but was simply what follows destruction when the noise has finished. She looked at the room, the books on the shelves, the photograph on the side table that showed Lucian and Celeste as children. A summer somewhere, both of them squinting into the same light. She looked at it and thought about what he'd told her about his mother. About 4 years of being told someone was coming back. About the architecture you build when you've learned that the people who should stay don't. She didn't touch him. It wasn't that kind of moment, but she said quietly, "I'm sorry." About her. He looked at the photograph. He said nothing. She was walking back toward the east wing, Marcus at a distance behind her, when her phone buzzed. She stopped in the corridor and looked at it, expecting Danny, expecting the unknown number again, expecting anything but what she saw. A news alert, local, a fire at a warehouse 12 miles east, and beneath it, a second message from the unknown number. The same burner, sent 4 minutes ago. Too late. "We already know you stayed. Celeste gave us the layout. We're coming tonight. There's nothing he can do." She read it twice. Then she looked up at the corridor, the long pale corridor of Lucian Blackthorn's house, with its high ceilings and its invisible staff and its 11-minute security rotation, and she felt the walls of it differently than she had every day she'd been here. Not as a prison, as the only structure between her and the thing coming toward her in the dark. And the difference between those two perceptions was the distance between the woman she'd been 2 weeks ago and the woman she was standing in this corridor right now, and she was not sure, in this moment, which one she was more afraid of becoming. She turned around and walked back toward Lucian's study at a pace that was not quite running, and when she reached the door, she didn't knock. She didn't knock. The door to his study opened under her hand, and Lucian was already at his desk, phone to his ear, and he looked up at her face and ended the call without saying goodbye to whoever was on the other end. That was how she knew he read her correctly. Not because of what she said, because she hadn't said anything yet, but because of what her face was doing, and he was a man who had spent a lifetime reading faces for the difference between manageable and not. She crossed the room and put her phone on the desk in front of him, screen up, message visible. He read it. He picked up the desk phone and said, "Full perimeter. Now. I want every exit locked and every exterior light on. Nobody moves in or out until I say." He set it down. He picked up a second phone, saw a different one, smaller, from the inside pocket of his jacket, and made another call that she heard only fragments of. "Tonight, yes, everything we have, the east wing first." Then he looked at her. "You need to go back to your rooms," he said. "I need to know what's happening. Vivian, I am not going to sit in a room and wait." She held his gaze. Her voice was steady, and she was making it steady through deliberate effort, through the same mechanism that had kept her functional through the debt, and the clinic, and the alley, and every day in this house. "I have a right to know what's coming at us." He looked at her for 1 second, then he said, "The Morettis have a team. Celeste gave them the layout of this property. Entry points, security patterns, staffing numbers. They've been planning this since she made contact. Tonight they move because they know we've found her out, which means their window is closing." He stood, coming around the desk. "What's coming is a coordinated incursion. Multiple entry points, time to overwhelm the perimeter simultaneously. They want you out of this house and under their control before I can consolidate a defense." "How many men?" "Enough." He moved to the wall panel to the left of the bookcase and pressed a sequence she didn't see fully, and the panel opened onto a narrow corridor she hadn't known existed. He looked back at her. "My people are better, but there will be a period before I can get everyone in position where the gaps are real. The East Wing. The East Wing is the most exposed." He held her gaze. "Which is why you are not going back there." She looked at the corridor behind the panel, dark, narrow, the smell of cold stone. "Where then?" "There's a secured room in the basement level. Reinforced, single entry, no exterior access. Marcus will take you there." "And you?" He was already moving toward the door of the study. "I'll be where I need to be." That's not an answer. He stopped. He turned to look at her from the doorway, and in the hard light of the study she saw him fully. This man who was the source of every problem she currently had, and also, by the brutal arithmetic of the situation, the only force currently positioned between her and something worse. She saw the controlled tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw, The eyes that watched her with that absolute attention that had started as unnerving and had become, without her fully authorizing the change, something she relied on. "Go with Marcus," he said. "Stay in the room. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't give you the word I'm about to tell you." He crossed back to her, and he was close, closer than he'd been in any of their conversations, close enough that she could see the slight irregularity of his breathing that told her the control was costing him. He said quietly, "Anchor. If someone comes to that door and doesn't say that word, you don't open it. You don't speak. You wait. And if no one comes," something moved in his face. "Someone will come. Lucian." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it. Not a plea, not a softness, but a demand for the real answer underneath the managed one. He looked at her for a moment that had too much in it to itemize. Then he said, "I will come." Marcus appeared at the door. Lucian moved past her, and they exchanged something in low voices that she caught the shape but not the content of. And then Lucian was gone, down the corridor toward the front of the house, moving with the quiet speed of a man who had been in situations like this before and had learned that hesitation was its own kind of decision. Marcus said, "Miss Mercer, we need to move." The basement was accessed through a door behind the kitchen that looked like a utility entrance and opened onto a stairwell that descended 2 full floors below the ground level of the house. The air changed immediately, cooler, drier, with the mineral stillness of deep stone. Marcus moved ahead of her with a flashlight, even though there were lights in the walls, because the flashlight was faster and he was not a man who trusted systems over tools he controlled himself. The room was at the end of a short corridor. Steel door, electronic lock, no windows, the walls the same pale stone as the foundation of the house. Inside, a cot, a small table, water, a first aid kit, a second phone that Marcus told her had a direct line to the security command post, and a monitor mounted on the wall cycling through exterior camera feeds. She looked at the monitor. Even from here, she could see the estate's perimeter lights blazing on, one after another, the cameras cycling through lit exteriors, the driveway, the garden, the tree line. The tree line, at the east edge of the property, was very dark beyond the reach of the lights. She watched it. Nothing moved. Yet. "How long?" she said. "Until they move?" Marcus checked his watch. "They'll wait for the lights to stabilize. They want to know the pattern before they commit." He looked at her directly. The first time he'd done so with real attention. "You're going to hear things, above us. It's going to be loud and it may go on for a while. You stay in this room." "I understand. The word is anchor. Don't open the door for anything else." "I heard him." Marcus held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know that people always believe they'll behave one way under pressure and often find out differently. Then he nodded. He left. The door sealed behind him with the solid sound of something engineered to hold. She sat on the cot. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs, the same gesture she'd been making for 2 weeks, the grounding mechanism, palms on legs, breath through the nose, and she looked at the monitor and made herself watch it systematically, each camera in sequence, driveway, front steps, east garden, west garden, the rear lawn, the tree line, the perimeter road. She went through the cycle twice, cataloging positions of Lucian's men she could identify. Dark figures moving into placement, unhurried but fast. The coordinated efficiency of professionals who had prepared for this contingency. Then the tree line moved. Not a branch, not wind. A darkness that had been static became not static, a shift in the mass of it that her eye caught before her brain named it. She leaned toward the monitor. The East Garden camera was the sharpest angle on that tree line, and she watched it and counted. 1 figure, 2, 3. More behind. She couldn't isolate the number. They were moving low and fast, and the lights didn't reach far enough to define them clearly. The first sound reached her 6 minutes later. It was not what she'd expected. She'd been braced for gunshots, the sharp, discrete sounds of a thing she'd only experienced through screens. What she heard first was different, a concussive thump from somewhere above and to the north, like a door being removed from a wall rather than opened, and then shouting that was immediately swallowed by distance and stone. Then the sound she'd been dreading. Gunfire, not one shot, multiple, overlapping, from more than one direction, the sounds coming through the stone ceiling in muffled bursts that her body responded to before her mind fully processed them, heart rate spiking, hands gripping the edge of the cot, the breath going shallow and fast. She forced it back. She pressed her spine straight and breathed through her nose. Count 4 in, count 4 out, and she kept her eyes on the monitor. The East Garden camera caught them first in clear frame. 4 men moving across the lawn toward the house in a tactical formation, low and fast, weapons up. 2 of Lucien's men came from the left side of the frame to intercept, and for a moment the screen showed her something she was entirely unprepared for. The reality of violence at close range, not stylized, not distant, just brutal and fast and decided in seconds. And then 2 of the 4 advancing figures were down, and the other 2 had split and moved out of the camera's angle. She stood. She couldn't stay on the cot. She moved to the monitor and stood directly in front of it, watching each feed as the camera cycled, her hands at her sides. The sounds from above intensifying and then dropping, and then intensifying again in a pattern she couldn't fully decode from here. The direct line phone on the table rang. She grabbed it. Ms. Mercer. A voice she recognized, one of the security team she'd seen in the corridors. We have movement inside the house. 2nd floor, north wing. It's contained, but I need you to confirm your door is sealed, and you have not admitted anyone. Sealed. No one's come. Stay on the line with me. She stayed on the line. She held the phone against her ear and watched the monitor and listened to the man on the other end of the call relay information to someone else in clipped shorthand that she parsed as best she could. North wing clear, east entry compromised, 2 down on our side. Lucian. She heard the name and her chest contracted. Lucian has eyes on the primary, moving to intercept. What does that mean? She said. Primary. A pause. It means he's located the leader of their team. Is he? She stopped. Is he? He's moving under his own direction, ma'am. That's all I have. The monitor cycled to the East Garden again. Empty now. The lawn cleared, the lights blazing on grass that showed her things she looked at and then looked away from. It cycled to the front drive, then to the rear, then to a camera she hadn't seen before, positioned at the interior of the house somewhere. A corridor on what looked like the ground floor, with emergency lighting giving everything a flat white quality that made it look like a stage. Lucian was in that corridor. She recognized him before she fully saw his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, the particular economy of it. He had a weapon in his right hand and he was moving toward the far end of the corridor where a door stood open at an angle that suggested it had been forced. 2 men she didn't recognize were behind him, close. Then a figure came through the forced door. She watched what happened in the corridor on a grainy monitor from 2 floors below, and she held the phone and she did not breathe through most of it. The confrontation was fast and specific, and nothing like the violence in films she'd seen. It was functional and close and decided by increments rather than choreography. Lucien took something across the left shoulder that sent him sideways into the wall, and she made a sound she hadn't intended to make, and the man on the phone said, Miss Mercer, and she said, I'm here, without taking her eyes off the monitor. Lucian did not go down. He came off the wall, and the thing that followed was not long and it was not uncertain. And when it was over, the figure who had come through the door was on the floor and Lucien was standing, and there was dark on his left side that she could see even through the poor camera quality, and she knew what color it was. He's hurt, she said. Our medical team is on standby. He's hurt, she said again, as if saying it twice would make the information go somewhere useful. The sounds from above had changed, less concentrated, more intermittent. The phone in her hand was relaying fragments she tried to assemble into a picture. Perimeter secure. North wing clear. 2 Moretti team members in custody. The rest either down or in retreat, the estate's response having been faster and harder than the Morettis had apparently planned for. Celeste's information about the security pattern outdated by the adjustments Lucien had been making since she'd arrived. She stood in the basement room with the phone at her ear, and her heart still running at a pace that was not sustainable, and watched the monitor cycle through cameras showing her an estate in the aftermath of something violent and decisive, and she waited. The knock came 40 minutes later. 1 knock, then, Anchor. She opened the door. He was standing in the corridor with Marcus 1 step behind him, and the dark on his left side was what she'd thought it was. His shirt saturated from the shoulder down, the color almost black in the low light of the basement corridor. His face was the same, controlled, focused, direct. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, something that the evening had taken the last layer of management off of. She looked at the wound. How bad? It went through. His voice was level. Clean exit. Sasha is upstairs. You need to be upstairs then. I needed to come here first. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same focused attention he always gave her. But the injury had done something. It had removed whatever buffer remained between the attention and whatever it was expressing, and what she saw now, looking at him in the basement corridor with his blood on his shirt and his left arm not moving the way it should, was not the controlled professional regard of a man assessing a situation. It was something much simpler and much more exposed, and she had not been prepared for the effect of seeing it, and she was too exhausted and too raw to build a wall against it fast enough. They're gone, he said. The estate is secure. He stopped. Something moved across his face. You're safe. You're bleeding through your shirt, she said. I know. Lucian. She said his name the same way she always said it when she needed him to stop managing the situation and inhabit it. Go upstairs and let the doctor look at you. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he said very quietly, something she hadn't expected, and that landed differently than anything else he'd said in 2 weeks. I was afraid I wouldn't get here in time. The basement corridor was very still. I know what I did to bring you here, he said. I know what I took from you. And when I was in that corridor, I was not thinking about the bloodline or the heirs or any of the things that I told myself this was about. He held her gaze. I was thinking about you. She didn't speak. That's all I wanted to say. He stepped back. Come upstairs. She followed him up the stairwell and through the kitchen and into the main body of the house. And around them the estate was reorganizing itself. Staff moving through corridors, security personnel sealing points of entry. The quiet, efficient machinery of a household absorbing what had happened and beginning to process it. She walked behind Lucian and watched him move. The slight accommodation in his gait for the shoulder, the way Marcus stayed half a step to his left, ready to catch weight that Lucian would never consciously concede, and she thought about what he'd said in the corridor. I was thinking about you. Not the children, not the bloodline. Her. She was not naive enough to build everything on 4 words from a man she'd known 2 weeks who had also imprisoned her and had people with guns intercept her at a medical appointment. She was not going to let the fear and the adrenaline and the compressed intimacy of 2 weeks inside his walls do the work that real time and real choice were supposed to do. But she filed it. She filed it in the part of her that had been keeping score of every true thing he'd said, every unmanaged moment, every place where the architecture of his control had cracked slightly and shown her what lived behind it. She filed it alongside the photograph she'd seen on Celeste's table, 2 children squinting into summer light, and the way he'd said my mother with that careful flatness, and the fact that he knocked before entering her rooms even when he didn't have to. Dr. Keene was in the main hall and she moved to Lucian with the directness of a woman who had patched up damage in this house before. And Vivian stopped at the base of the stairs and watched her begin to assess the wound with efficient hands, and Lucian bore it with the slightly reluctant compliance of a man who considered medical attention an imposition. He looked across the hall at Vivian. She looked back. Then a sound reached her from the upper level. Sharp, specific, not violent, but wrong in a way she registered before she identified it. A sound from somewhere in the east wing, which was supposed to be empty now, which was supposed to be cleared. And she saw Marcus's head come up at the same moment and saw his hand go to his radio. And she saw Lucian's eyes leave her face and go hard in the space of 1 second. And then the lights in the main hall went out. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Then the emergency generator engaged, and the hall lights came back at half power, amber and flat, casting everything in a quality that made the familiar strange. Vivian stood at the base of the stairs and did not move because movement required knowing which direction was safe, and she did not know that yet. Marcus was already on his radio, his voice low and rapid. Dr. Keene had her hand on Lucian's good arm, and Lucian had removed it with a gentleness that was also absolute and was moving toward the east wing staircase. Stay here, he said. Not to Marcus. To Vivian. She stayed. She counted her breaths and watched the stairs and listened to the house. The sound from above had stopped, which was either better or worse than if it had continued. And the silence it left was the pressurized kind, the kind that has something inside it. Marcus finished his radio exchange and looked at her. 2 of our people are not responding on the East Wing level. The sweep we ran after the perimeter was cleared. It may have missed an interior position. Someone was already inside, she said, before the main team moved. Yes, a separate element. His jaw was tight. It's a tactic. You send the primary force to draw the defensive response, you leave a smaller unit in place already. And their target is the East Wing, she said. My rooms. Yes. She looked at the stairs. He's going up there alone. He has 2 men with him. He has a bullet hole in his shoulder. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who agreed with her assessment and had already made peace with the fact that it changed nothing. Miss Mercer. She was already moving toward the stairs. He didn't stop her, which she registered with the part of her brain that was still cataloging information even now. Marcus had made a calculation, and the calculation had concluded that stopping her would cost more than letting her go. She took the stairs fast, one hand on the rail, and at the top she turned toward the East Wing and the corridor that she had walked every day for 2 weeks, and that looked different now under the emergency lighting. The familiar doors and pale walls rendered an amber shadow that flattened depth and made distances unreliable. She heard Lucien before she saw him, his voice, that controlled, unhurried voice, coming from the direction of the sitting room she'd been given, the door open at the end of the corridor, the light inside wrong. She moved toward it, and the closer she got, the more she could hear a second voice, one she did not recognize, and under both voices a sound that it took her a moment to identify. Something breaking, very slowly, the way ice breaks, the sound of structural collapse in a small and specific register. She reached the doorway and stopped. The sitting room was in partial ruin. The window she had measured and planned against in her first days here had been breached, the glass gone, the frame warped outward, the night air moving through it with the smell of cold and broken wood. One of Lucien's men was on the floor against the far wall, conscious but not moving under his own power, his hand pressed to his side. The second man was positioned in the interior doorway to the bedroom, blocking it. In the center of the room stood a woman Vivian had never seen. She was in her 60s, and she was expensively dressed in the specific way of someone for whom expense is not a choice, but a condition, an ambient fact of existence. Her hair was silver and precisely arranged, and she stood with the particular posture of someone who had not in a very long time been in a room where she was not the axis around which everything else organized. She was not holding a weapon. She didn't need one. The 2 men flanking her, positioned at the edges of the room, held those. Lucien stood between Vivian and this woman. He had not heard Vivian approach, or he had, and the slight adjustment in his posture told her he'd registered her presence without turning, without acknowledging it, because acknowledging it would direct attention toward her. She understood that immediately. She stayed in the doorway and did not move. Evelyn, Lucien said. The name landed in the room, and Vivian understood before anything else was said. The woman, his mother, looked at her son with an expression that was not warm and was not cold, but was something more disturbing than either. The expression of someone who has long since moved past feeling into pure strategic appraisal, for whom the person in front of them is a piece in a configuration rather than a human being to be regarded. "You look like your father," Evelyn Blackthorne said. "You always did? It was never a compliment." "You need to leave," Lucien said. "I've been leaving for 30 years, Lucien. I've gotten quite good at it." She tilted her head slightly. "I came for something specific. I don't intend to stay. You're not taking anything from this house." "I'm not taking a thing." Her eyes moved, past him, to the doorway, to Vivian. And she looked at Vivian the way she'd looked at Lucien, with that appraising absence of warmth, and Vivian held the gaze because she had learned in 2 weeks that flinching was a form of information she was not going to give away. "I came to talk to her." "No," Lucien said. "What she carries is more than yours," Evelyn said, still looking at Vivian. "This family has operated according to a succession model for 3 generations. What she carries is the continuation of that model. I have a vested interest that predates your claim." "You have no claim," Lucien said. You left this family. You left this house. You left... He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked once. You left. That concluded your interest in anything that carries this name. A court might disagree. You won't reach a court. Evelyn smiled. It was a precise and bloodless thing. There's the blackthorn I recognize. She took one step to the side, angling toward Vivian, and both her men adjusted in response, a smooth recalibration. My son is a capable man. He's also a damaged one. You've had 2 weeks to observe the damage, Ms. Mercer. I had 30 years to cause it. She paused. He will never let you leave, not really. When those children are born, you become a variable he can't control. And Blackthorn men do not tolerate variables. Stop, Lucian said. She deserves the truth. You don't know what truth is. You know what's useful. They're the same thing. Evelyn looked at her son, and for the first time something moved behind the appraisal. Something that might, in a different woman, have been pain, but in her was so long calcified that it came out as something else entirely. I left because I saw what this life would make of you. I was correct. Look at what you are. I know what I am, Lucian said. Then you know she should leave. She will leave, he said, when she chooses to. Not when you decide she should, and not through a window in the dark with your people waiting outside. Vivian had been standing in the doorway processing the geometry of the room. 2 armed men, one incapacitated Blackthorn operative, Lucian with a wound that had been bleeding for 40 minutes, and a woman who had just demonstrated that she'd planned a secondary infiltration concurrent with the Moretti assault, which meant either coordination with the Morettis or opportunism, and either way meant the room had to end differently than it was currently heading. She stepped fully into the room. Lucian said her name, a sharp, quiet warning. She ignored it and walked to the center of the room, stopping beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and she looked at Evelyn Blackthorn directly. You came here to take my children, she said, not out of love, not out of legacy in any meaningful sense. You came because they're leverage, and you've spent 30 years building a position on the outside of this family that requires something to trade. She kept her voice even. That's the truth. The rest of what you said, about Lucian, about what he is, what this life makes people, maybe some of it is accurate. I don't know you well enough to say, but your motive is transparent and it has nothing to do with what's best for anyone in this room. Evelyn looked at her with something that was almost appreciation. You're smarter than I expected. Most people are. And what do you propose to do? You're in a room with 2 of my men, one of his who can't stand, and a son who's losing blood. She was perfectly calm. The arithmetic is not in your favor. The arithmetic, Marcus said from the doorway behind Vivian, just changed. Vivian did not turn. She heard it, the particular quality of the silence that followed, the way the 2 armed men in the room recalculated, the way the calculation came out in a direction Evelyn had not prepared for, the arrival of a number she hadn't accounted for. She kept her eyes on Evelyn and watched it happen. Watched the assurance drain slowly from that precise and bloodless face. Watched the strategic appraisal run new numbers and find that they didn't balance. Evelyn Blackthorn looked at her son. Lucian said nothing. He didn't need to. What followed was not a surrender so much as an acknowledgement, the kind of acknowledgement that sophisticated people make when the situation has genuinely moved past their control and the cost of resistance outweighs the possible gain. Evelyn's men put their weapons down. Evelyn herself remained still and composed, and she looked at the room with the expression of someone storing information for a future engagement, which told Vivian that this was not over, not in any permanent way, not tonight. Lucian seemed to know it too. He crossed to his mother, and he stood in front of her, and what happened on his face in those few seconds was not something Vivian looked away from, because she understood that she was watching something that had been 30 years in arriving, and that the watching of it was a form of witness that the moment required. You're done, he said. Evelyn looked up at her son. Not tonight, he said. Done. Every account, every property, every arrangement you have that touches this family's infrastructure. It's gone by morning. The position you've built, whatever it is, whatever pieces you used, I'll find every one of them and I'll remove them. He spoke without heat, without the grief that Vivian suspected was somewhere beneath it, because he had learned to put grief somewhere it couldn't interfere with function. You will leave this country. Where you go is not my concern, but you will not be reachable to anyone in my world. You will have enough to live on. You will have nothing else. Lucian, I'm not angry, he said, which was so clearly partially true that the partial untruth of it was its own kind of statement. I stopped being angry about you a long time ago. What I am is finished. That's different. He stepped back. Marcus will take you out. She looked at him for a moment. This woman who had left a 6-year-old waiting for 4 years and had returned now with flanking men and a plan to take what his life had built. She looked at him, and something moved across her face that Vivian could not fully name, something that in a different life, with different architecture, might have been the beginning of remorse. But it was too late, and she was too far built in another direction, and so it came out as nothing, or nothing that translated into action, and she let Marcus's men take her arms, and she walked out of the east wing and out of the house. The room was very quiet after. Dr. Keene appeared at the doorway approximately 90 seconds later because she had been behind Marcus, and she came in with her bag and went directly to the man on the floor. And then she looked at Lucian with the expression of someone who has told a person to rest and watched them do the opposite. "Sit down," she said to him. He sat on the edge of the chair near the broken window. The night air moved through the gap, and the emergency lighting gave everything that amber flatness. And he sat with his hands on his knees and let Dr. Keene begin to work on the shoulder wound with the resigned compliance of a man who has run out of immediate crises to manage and must now tolerate being cared for. Vivian sat on the floor. Not the chair, not the cot in the adjoining room. The floor, her back against the wall, her legs out in front of her, because the floor was the most honest surface available, and she had been performing composure for approximately 4 hours, and she was done performing. She sat on the floor and she breathed, and the 3 lives inside her were still there, still present, their existence not interrupted by any of the night's events, which was both the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing she could think of. Lucian looked at her from the chair. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have been through a common experience that has changed the proportion of things, and who are in the process of recalibrating what is large and what is small. "Your mother," she said finally. "Yes." She organized that separately from the Morettis. Opportunism. She's always been. She watches situations and she moves when the moment opens. He paused. She and Aldo Moretti were likely in contact, but separately. She would never fully partner with the Morettis. Too much professional pride. She wanted the children for leverage. She wants a seat back at this table, has for years. The children are the most direct path back to relevance. He looked at his hands. She's not capable of wanting them for any other reason. I've known that for a long time. Is she actually gone? Vivian asked. The exile. Will it hold? I'll make it hold. He said it quietly, without the performance of certainty, just the flat statement of a man describing work he intends to do. She looked at him, at the dressed wound on his shoulder, the lines of exhaustion in his face, the hands on his knees. The same posture she used, she realized, the palms down grounding gesture, and she didn't know what to do with the recognition of that shared habit. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. When the lights went out, she said, and I came upstairs, I didn't come because I thought I could help. I don't have training, I'm not equipped for any of what happened tonight in any practical sense. She kept her eyes on him. I came because I couldn't stay downstairs. I couldn't be in that room not knowing what was happening to you. She paused. I want you to know that I'm aware of what that means and what it doesn't mean. I'm not saying it's resolved. 2 weeks is not enough time to resolve what you did to bring me here. The way this started is not something that disappears because the ending changed, right? Bushin. He nodded. He was listening the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. But I'm also not going to pretend it doesn't mean something, she said, that I was upstairs, that I couldn't stay away. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the morning after the wedding, I told myself I would find you, I didn't plan any of this. I told myself I'd find you and I'd tell you that I'd spent 6 hours at a table with someone I hadn't expected and I wanted to know if she'd have dinner with me. He looked at the floor briefly. Then I found out about the pregnancy and I made the worst decision I've made in a long time, because I was afraid of losing something before I understood what it was. He looked up at her. I know what it is now. She held his gaze. I'm going to do something I've never done, he said. I'm going to ask you what you want, not what the situation requires, not what's safest or most defensible or strategically sound. He held her gaze steadily. What do you want? She thought about the studio apartment, the $11.40, the debt collector at 6:53 in the morning, the woman she'd been walking into that clinic, the particular loneliness of her, the gray sweater and the tight hair and the crackers for breakfast, the version of herself that had been drowning so gradually she hadn't noticed how far above her head the water was. She thought about 3 heartbeats on a grainy screen. She thought about a man in a corridor saying, I was thinking about you, with blood on his shirt, and the admission costing him something visible. I want to stay, she said, not because I don't have anywhere else to go. I want you to hear the difference, not because you've made it impossible to leave, because I want to. She let the words settle. But I need it to be a choice, an actual choice, which means if I decide to leave tomorrow or next week or after they're born, the door is open. He said, without hesitation, the door is open. And the monitoring, done. And the, whatever you need removed, I'll remove it. He held her gaze. I'm asking you to stay, Vivian. I'm not requiring it. I know the difference. I should have known it from the beginning. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, okay. Just that. Okay. The smallest word for the largest thing, which was how the largest things usually went. Dr. Keene finished with Lucian's shoulder and told him he needed to sleep, and told Vivian her blood pressure needed to be checked in the morning, and told them both, with the weary authority of a woman who had been managing the health of complicated people in complicated situations for a long time, that the rest of it could wait until daylight. They listened to her. For once, they both simply listened. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing that had been broken was repaired quickly, and Vivian had no illusions about the speed of trust or the clean resolution of complicated things. There were arguments, real ones, in which she said what she meant, and he learned, with visible effort, to stay in the room when things became difficult, rather than retreat into the managed distance that was his default. There were nights when she lay awake and thought about the woman she'd been and the life that had been miserable and small and entirely hers, and felt the pull of it, not because she wanted it back, but because it had been simple in the way that difficult lives are simple. She had known what she was surviving. This was harder to name. This required more. He gave her the financial independence he'd promised. Accounts in her name, the resources to leave if she chose to, because the offer meant nothing if it required asking for it. She called Danny, finally, in a real conversation that lasted 2 hours and involved more crying than either of them had done in years. And Danny said, I knew something was wrong, and Vivian said, I know. And neither of them said the rest because the rest was too large for a phone call. Danny came to visit in the 5th month. She stood in the entrance hall of the estate and looked at the high ceilings and the pale stone and the staff moving at the periphery, and then she looked at Lucian, who had come out to meet her because Vivian had told him it mattered, and he extended his hand and said, Your sister speaks about you constantly, which was not a performed warmth. It was simply true. And Danny shook his hand and looked at him for a long moment with the focused assessment of an older sister who has watched someone she loves make difficult choices for a long time. Later after dinner, Danny found Vivian in the East Wing sitting room, the window replaced now, the room itself repaired and changed enough that it no longer looked like the room where the night had happened. And she sat across from her sister and said, Is this real? Yes, Vivian said. Is he? He's not safe, Vivian said. The world he's in isn't safe. I know that. But he's real, which is rarer than safe, as it turns out. Danny looked at her for a long time. Then she said, You look different. I'm 30 pounds heavier. Not that. Danny shook her head. You look like someone who's decided something. Evelyn Blackthorne did not return. The exile held. Lucian had been thorough, as he was thorough with everything he committed to, and within 6 weeks the position she'd built had been methodically dismantled, the accounts closed, the arrangements dissolved, The infrastructure she'd depended on redirected. She was in Europe, then South America, a woman of means with no means of leverage, and Lucian did not speak of her after the first month, and Vivian did not ask, and the silence around her name was not unprocessed grief, but something closer to a decision made and accepted. The closing of a door that had been open too long. Celeste sent a letter in the 4th month. Not an email, a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, which Lucian read once and left on the desk without discussing. Vivian picked it up later and read it with his knowledge, because secrets in this house had cost them enough. Celeste wrote about their childhood in a way that was honest about the damage and dishonest about nothing, and she wrote about what she'd done without excuse. And at the end she wrote, "I told myself I was giving her a choice. I knew I wasn't. I've spent 4 months knowing I wasn't." Vivian read it and felt the complicated things she expected to feel. Not forgiveness, because that was still too far, but the beginning of the long road toward it, which was its own kind of progress. She wrote back. 3 sentences. "I read it. I understand more than I did. Give it time." She didn't know if it was enough. She sent it anyway because leaving things entirely closed was not something she was willing to do with her own hands. The labor came 6 weeks early. It came in the night, which was when the significant things seemed to happen in this house. And it came fast, and then very slowly, and then fast again in the way of complicated deliveries. And Vivian was in the medical suite that Dr. Keene had established in the estate's south wing. And the suite was very bright and very cold, and the pain was not like anything she had been told pain was, and she held the hand of the nurse, and then she held Lucian's hand, which had appeared at some point without her requesting it, and she did not let go of it for a long time. He did not speak much. He stayed at the head of the bed where she could see him when she turned, and he held her hand with both of his, the repaired shoulder and the other. And every time she looked at him, he was looking at her, not at the monitors or at Dr. Keene or at the doorway. At her. The first son came at 2:14 in the morning. He was small and furious, and his voice was extraordinary, a sound that filled the room with the specific and particular fact of his existence. They placed him briefly in Vivian's arms, and she looked at him, this face that was new to the world, that had no history yet. And she felt something she had no prior experience of, a quality of love that had no self-protection in it at all, no reservation, nothing held back. She looked at Lucian. His face was completely open, not managed, not controlled. He was looking at his son, and the architecture of control that she had spent months learning to read had come down entirely. And what was underneath it was not what she had expected. It was not the hard man she'd met in the alley, or the cold strategist of the study, or even the wounded son from the corridor confessions. It was something simpler and more fundamental than all of those. A man who had spent his entire life building walls against the experience of being left, who was now holding a person so new they couldn't leave yet, and who was, for the first time she had seen, completely undone. He looked at her. His eyes were wet, and he did not manage it, and she did not comment on it, and neither of them needed to say anything about what it meant. The second son came 20 minutes later. The daughter came last, smaller than her brothers, quieter, with the considering expression of someone who has arrived at a situation and is taking her time assessing it before committing to an opinion. Vivian laughed when she saw that expression, actually laughed, through the exhaustion and the pain and the bright lights of the suite, because she recognized it, because she'd been making that face her whole life. Lucian held each of them in turn. He held them with the particular focused attention he gave to everything that mattered, and he held them as if he understood that this was not a thing to be managed, but a thing to be present for. And he held them long enough to learn the weight of each one separately, the distinct and individual fact of each person. When it was over and the room had quieted and the 3 infants had been settled in the warming beds nearby, and Vivian was resting against the raised mattress, with the particular bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has moved a mountain with their body, Lucian sat beside her bed in the chair that had been placed there at some point in the night, and he held her hand, and he did not try to fill the quiet. After a while she said, "3. 3, he said. "We made 3 people." He looked at the warming beds where 3 small lives were breathing in the careful way of the newly born. "We did." She turned her head to look at him. "Ask me again," she said. He looked at her. "What you asked me," she said. "The night your mother left." "Ask me again." He was quiet for a moment. He understood what she was doing. She was making it clean, making it a real question asked under real conditions, not the night's adrenaline and wreckage, but this. This room, this morning, these three people breathing nearby. "What do you want?" he said. She held his gaze in the quiet and early light of the room. She thought about the studio apartment, the crackers, the gas station bathroom, and the two lines in the parking lot at 2 in the morning. She thought about $11.40 and the particular gray of that morning, the sweater, the tight hair. She thought about everything that the woman she'd been before all of this would have said if someone had told her where she'd be in a year. Then she thought about what she actually was, not what circumstance had made her, what she had made herself in the middle of all of it. The fight, the anger, the refusal to be managed, the choice to come upstairs when she should have stayed below, the 3 words sent to a sister she barely knew yet who wrote 3 honest pages. "This," she said, "I want this." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment, and she felt the warmth of it, and the room was quiet. And outside the windows, the morning was coming in gray and then gold over the estate's old trees, and the 3 new people in the warming beds breathed their careful New World breaths. And the story that had started in a gas station parking lot at 2 in the morning and had passed through terror and betrayal and violence and the slow, necessary work of 2 damaged people learning each other's real shape, that story settled finally into something that was not an ending so much as a beginning that had been hard-won enough to last. He proposed 3 months later in the garden with no performance and no grandeur. He simply asked, quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, and she said yes before he'd finished the sentence, not because she hadn't considered it, but because she had considered it every day for 3 months, and the answer had never changed. They were married in the estate's south garden in early autumn. Small, no audience beyond the people who had earned the right to be there, and Danny stood beside her sister and cried without apology, and Vivian held her hand and did not cry until the moment he looked at her. And then she did, and she didn't manage it, and she didn't try. The life they built was not safe. The world did not become simple because they had chosen each other inside it. There were costs to the name he carried and risks that did not disappear and complications that required more from both of them than easy things require. But they were, both of them, people who had been shaped by difficulty into something that could hold weight without breaking, and they held it together, which made all the difference. The children grew. They were loud and particular and entirely themselves from the very beginning, which was perhaps the truest thing their parents gave them. The example of 2 people who had arrived at themselves the hard way and were no longer pretending to be anyone else. And in the house with the old trees and the stone walls and the history of difficult things, there was finally the thing that neither of them had believed they would have, a family that stayed. Not because it was required, because it was chosen. Every single day, chosen again. That was enough. That was everything.